We're going to have a look at an integrated task rubric. So we have an extract here from the subject outline where you can see in each of the criterion they're talking about both the presentation and the oral components. So there's two different parts of the process for the students, obviously, with the submission of the product into Brightspace, into an assignment submission portal, and then the mini Viva or the oral component evaluation that happens after that. So we're going to take the content that is in this document and we're going to put it into the Brightspace rubric tool, and I'll show you some ways that you can approach that before we then attach it to an assignment and look at the marking process with that rubric for both parts of that task. So as I said, we have this document extract, and you'll note that the criterion currently mention marks. There's no percentages or anything mentioned anywhere else, it's just the marks here, and the weighting for this task currently is 40%. So if we go into the Brightspace rubrics tool, I've actually created three different approaches. I'll show you the difference between each that we could take with this rubric. The first one being, if I open this, we've used the same task weighting, so marking out of 40, and what I've done is taken the original 6 criterion and created a product section in the rubric. So this label actually says product criterion. It looks better when we preview it, but there are 6 product criteria, and you'll notice that instead of it talking about 8 marks, it's now 4, so I've halved them all because it's a 50-50 split in an integrated activity between the product criteria and the supervised criteria. So we have 6 criteria down the page, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with the marks halved. And then I have created, if we go past product criterion 6, I've created a second section, and Brightspace calls these, if we go down the bottom, criteria groups. So you can create these separate sections in the rubric tool by going down and adding another criterion group. And my second section I've called supervised criteria, or SC, and then you'll notice that I've got that same nomenclature here, SC1 through to SC6, with the other half of those split marks. So we have 2 sections with one part for marking the product, one part for marking the supervised component, and that's done by creating those 2 group categories. And the last thing that I'll mention down the bottom is that the overall score section at the bottom of the rubric has been populated with our HD through to fail continuum with a mark essentially out of 40, what that means. So 85% of 40 being 34 or more. So when the student has the rubric total tallied, scored, etc., it'll also give that representation of what that amounts to. The last thing to consider is in the options section of rubrics, and I generally advise this for all rubrics, is that you select rubric is hidden from students until the feedback is published. And the reason for that being that if you don't check this, that entire rubric, and it could be pages and pages and pages when you scroll down, the student will have to view all of that every time they go to submit something in the assignment portal before they can actually find the area to add a file and submit. So rather than it being arduous in that sense, they've already got the academic integrity, generative AI disclaimers, all that sign off, etc. to go through before they can attach the file. I don't think they need to actually access the rubric there. You can get the rubric from the subject outline. So they'll get this back once the paper is marked and published. Alright, so we have our rubric ready. The other samples that I have in place there, the main difference being, for this one, instead of marking out of 40, I've changed it to marking out of 100, as a lot of schools prefer to do that, because Brightspace will convert whatever you mark the rubric out of back to the task weighting automatically. So in this case, this is marked out of 100, so instead of those 4 marks that we talked about before, it actually amounts to 10% of this task, and that weighting sits in here. So the scoring is done out of 100 instead of out of 40. Other than that, it's the same in every respect, except for one other area, which is that the Brightspace Rubric tool has an area called Initial Feedback that you may or may not have used, and we can pre-populate this with text or comments, etc. And all I've done here is put in marker initial as a field, so that when your markers are coming through and scoring this rubric, and I'm assuming that it's quite possible that you'll have a different marker marking the product as opposed to marking the supervised component, that you may want to capture an initial, for example, so that you can know who the marker was for each element. That's up to you. You don't have to put it in there, but if we do, it will allow the markers, whether they're using a mobile device or on a laptop or whatever, to fill that out as a part of the marking process as well. So that's completely at your discretion whether you add that in or not. So that's the second approach, scoring out of 100 in the rubric. And lastly, we have here, instead of separating out the rubric into 2 different sections, instead what we have here is that each criterion has been labelled 1A and 1B for the product submission and the supervised element, and you'll notice that after 1A we have 1B. So you can obviously populate these labels and the criterion text with whatever information you like, but the concept is you mark the product area and then directly underneath you have the supervised area, so that the marking can be completed with those 2 located next to each other. So there isn't 2 sections in the rubric, it's all just one rubric flowing, one criterion after the other, with them separated into 1A, 1B. So that is another option if you're considering doing that. Probably the way that I would suggest at this point in time is to either marking out of 100 or the original task weighting, separating out the product submission marking versus the supervised component marking, so using those 2 sections. Alright, so we have our rubrics. Next up, we'd need to attach the rubric that we want to use to an assignment portal. Same process that we would normally go through when we create an assignment. You go into your evaluation area and you would add a rubric, add an existing rubric, and then we get our supervised rubric that you're using with its 2 sections. I've added one here already for us to use. Alright, let's have a look at what that looks like when we actually go to mark. So if I open my dashboard for this task, we can see here that the lovely Adam Lavelle has submitted his product, so he's submitted his document for marking. Your product marker would then go to the evaluation, open up the document, get the preview on the left. Once that loads, we'll note that our rubric is sitting here waiting for us on the right hand side, so they could mark up, annotate the product component if that's what they're going to do, still use the overall feedback areas, etc. if they're inclined to do so, but we're interested in the rubric. So let's open up our rubric. You could either use the condensed form here and use the handlebars to drag that out if you want it in that smaller section of the screen, or we can pop it out full screen. So let's do that. And here's our rubric. So I'm marking the product and you can see our labels here. So I've got 6 product criterion to do as part of my marking, and I would be going through and choosing each part. You can modify your individual scores if you need to over on the right, but I'll take the default amount there, 7.5. And you'll notice that marker initial that I was mentioning before. If you've added that field to your rubric, I could then go in here and put in, that was me. If you wanted other things in here, dates and other things, of course you can have those in there as well, but it may just be that certainly for the supervised component, it's possible that you want to capture who the the markers are, that's entirely up to you, but the feature is there if you want to use it. Let's continue with the marking. Okay, I've given him a mark. I'm up to the 4th criterion, 5th and 6th. Alright, so I've done PC 1 through 6. If I scroll to the bottom of the rubric, you'll see that it has the currently tallied totals sitting there waiting for me. This auto saves, and what I mean by that is it will have already flowed through to the overall grade area, but only half the marking is done, remember, so we're not going to publish this. We only want our markers to be saving as draft, as always, until the convener is ready to publish the whole lot. So our marking of the first part of our integrated activity is done effectively. You may want to be using feedback areas within the rubric to provide individual commentary on criterion feedback. You can certainly do that, but otherwise the most important part is that we are capturing the marking for the first part, the product marking, before we're then ready to move on to the second part, the supervised marking. Alright, so my marking of the first part is done. I'm going to close this rubric. As I said, it auto saves. That's sitting in there now. It's flowed through already to the overall grade. I'm going to save my draft and go out of this because the first part is marked. Alright, so I have my draft saved. It tells me when that happened. And now let's assume that we're ready for the supervised component to happen, and either the same or a different marker is coming in to open up exactly the same evaluation, same portal, same rubric. Open up the rubric. We can see that our original selections are still in place with the scores. No, I'm not doing the product criteria now, I'm doing the supervised criteria. So if I move down to the second section of this rubric, supervised criteria, here we go. So now it's time for the supervised marker to put in their marks. So same process, move through, select each of the criteria, put in feedback if you need to. You'll notice that it's tallying on the right hand side. Subject criteria 5 now, supervised criteria, now we're up to 6, last one. And if I go to the bottom, I have my score out of 100 tallied, and that's telling me in the overall score that amounts to a credit. Yep, that all looks pretty kosher to me. Close this. That's flowed through because the overall grade will take the latest updated mark from a rubric. So that update has now flowed through to the overall grade, and my marking of the supervised component is now done. Maybe there'll be some other overall feedback, etc., but the marking in the rubric for both parts of the task is complete. So again, save the draft. And this is now technically ready for publishing, at which point that total mark will flow through to the gradebook, and the student would then get access to that rubric with those marks and whatever feedback you've put in there. So we've used the one single rubric and the one submission portal for the students to submit their product and for the marking of the supervised component to happen. The last thing I'll point out is that if you're dealing with larger numbers, larger cohorts, you may want to consider using the groups tool to set up groups for the marking of the product versus the marking of the supervised groups, and I've done exactly that here. In this case, for example, I set up groups of product markers who might be completely different to the supervised markers. So I've created that set of groups, and then I've created a different set of groups for the supervised element of the activity. And if I'm then trying to find them later on, I can narrow this down and find my grouping of students. It's going to be especially helpful when you're dealing with large cohorts of students, and obviously narrowing this down. Alright, so that is a breakdown of how we take an integrated task activity with a text out of subject outline and put it into Brightspace. A couple of different options for how to approach the rubric, and then how we mark those through the assignment dashboard, engaging with that same rubric multiple times. Thank you.